Thank you, Mary. Although I won't be talking about dance today. Thank you very much for the invitation. I'm delighted to be able to speak, and I feel honored. Although I've called my paper Cultural Fantasies of the Virtuoso and the Trauma of Attachment, its focus will be on attachment rather than on trauma, on a vexed, uncomfortable, and potentially traumatic kind of attachment. And I'm saying this to start with because of the now well-rehearsed caution against a proliferation of the concept of trauma and the need for careful definition. What I'm looking at here is not historically specific moments, but psychic structures of potentially traumatic attachment. However, my interest in such structures was raised by literary and performative figures that are of historical specificity. They belong to the period of Romanticism. And although I won't make explicit reference to the work of Cathy Caruth, the kinds of reading that I propose would be unthinkable without the impact that her 1996 unclaimed experience has had on my research autobiography. When I encountered this book through the essay on Kleist, Kant, and Demand, I was myself working on Kleist at the time. It was the literary dimension of your trauma studies that I found absolutely compelling. The ways in which you have shown that literature can acquire the function of clear-sighted testimony, not despite, but precisely because of its figurative qualities, because of its interest in the complex relation between knowing and not knowing, an interest that literature shares with psychoanalysis. Psychoanalysis identifies as a condition for autonomy a series of splittings, a series of partings, which one can never fully know nor simply leave behind. If the focus in trauma studies is on more acute experiences of parting, my paper shifts attention to the fact that partings in psychic life are accompanied by instances of prohibition, whether real, imaginary, or symbolic, and that these instances offer new kinds of attachments when others have to be left behind. In order to think through such attachments, Judith Butler's Psychic Life of Power will be my main port of call in the following. She explains one of the key points of her argument from a Freudian perspective. The subject emerges, and this is quote 1, on the condition of a separation enforced through prohibition, formed through the attachment to prohibition, in obedience to it, but also eroticizing it. And this prohibition is all the more savory precisely because it is bound up in the narcissistic circuit that wards off the dissolution of the subject into psychosis. So much by way of introduction, and to set the scene. By starting the theory, I have taken the second step before the first one, and I want to go back to the first one now to give you an idea why attachment has become an important concept in my current research. This research is concerned with cultures of virtuosity and the ways in which they do not only transgress the musical paradigm that might first come to mind when one hears the term, but also the forms that virtuosity acquires after its 19th century heyday. But what I'd like to present today are aspects of the 19th century musical paradigm that form cornerstones for my exploration of virtuosity in modernism. Our relationship with virtuosity is ambivalent, writes pianist-philosopher Vladimir Jankelevich, that's quote number 2. The virtuoso does not content himself with interpreting the work. He creates it anew under conditions that sometimes appear to be superhuman. Interpreter and creator are becoming one for the duration of a sonata. This is why we experience at once admiration and resentment. We object to our own admiration. The virtuoso might be a charlatan who is making a fool of us, an acrobat who mystifies. We admire the superlative deed, but we do not want to be deceived. This ambivalence sums up our relationship to music in general. We accuse music for holding us under its spell. However, what emerges when one looks at the countless reviews of virtuoso concerts is a public that not only accused the virtuoso performer for casting a phony spell. First and foremost, this public enjoyed being subdued. But how can we explain the extraordinary effect of virtuoso performance? An exploration of 19th century sources suggests that much more is at stake than music alone. A specific kind of charisma, both performative and discursive, surrounded the superlative musician. This charisma was nourished in a reciprocal relationship between the one on stage and the mass public. Let us consider the legendary violinist Niccolo Paganini as prototypical early 19th century virtuoso, whose fame came to a peak during his European tour between 1828 and 1835. A journal article placed at the end of Julius Max Schottky's 1830 Paganini's Leben und Treiben, which was among the first publications on the artist, sums up the musician's impact on his audience, and I've translated that, as I won't be doing any close reading here. With his violin, he speaks a language of the soul which resonates in the minds of those who are perceptive, and even if they do not comprehend its sounds, they can feel it in an obscure manner, so that this language leaves a lasting and strange impression, particularly on women. This impression is nostalgic rather than consoling or exhilarating, and its uncanny effect is probably enhanced by Paganini's personality. Two very reasonable ladies, one of whom a respected musical connoisseur, assured me independently of each other that they have been moved in the above suggested ways to such an extent that they were unable during the night after the concert to shake off their impression of Paganini. Only a superior artist is able to yield this kind of impact, resulting from the artful ways of making his instruments speak, so that he can transpose the state of his mind onto the mind of his listener, den Zustand seines Gemüts auf ein anderes zu übertragen weiß. It's rare to find such a nuanced description of what seems to have constituted Paganini's specific charisma, the transmission of his state of mind onto others. And I do not particularly focus on the gendering of this in this paper, but we may want to come back to this in the discussion. The violinist's playing is described as dictating experiences of affective engagement and streamlining them according to its own logic. A critique of 14 December 1829, published in the Morgenblatt, locates Paganini's genius in this particular type of charisma. A true master over their minds, ein Geisterbezwinger, the artist subjects his listeners by controlling their feelings and rules over them through the power of his notes. And again, I do not have time here to share more examples of literary and journalistic discourse on virtuosity, but what transpires is that texts are replete with associations of the sublime, its sovereignty, but also its violence, its immediate coercive impact, its uncanniness, and its induction of ambivalent feelings of submission. The virtuoso sublime. Burke defines sublime experience in his philosophical inquiry as, quote, for that state of the soul in which all its motions are suspended with some degree of horror. In this case, the mind is so entirely filled with its object that it cannot entertain any other, nor by consequence reason on that object which employs it. Hence arises the great power of the sublime, that far from being produced by them, it anticipates our reasonings and hurries us on by an irresistible force. Burke's description resounds with the 1829 Morgenblatt critique that speaks of a state of mindless trance provoked by the fact that Paganini, quote 5, divides and isolates, so to speak, the emotions and feelings of the audience from their reason, so that they are unable to control their thoughts as long as he reigns over them. Recovering their ability to reflect upon what they underwent only in retrospect, Paganini's listeners are overwhelmed by an imaginary force that causes a displeasurable state, or as Burke's man humbled by the sublime has it a state of delightful horror. The sorrow is part of feelings of self-preservation, and therefore indeed delightful, Burke argues, as long as the sublime experience is an aesthetic one. What in real life would be mortal fear can be enjoyed in tranquility tinged with terror. The virtuoso's imposition of his mind onto an audience may be presented as a kind of fusion, much in keeping with historical ideas about aesthetic perception. Yet what is discussed in other contexts as a type of aesthetic fertilization assumes the characteristic of a rape in the case of virtuosity, which may be a strong word. I have taken it from Adam Phillips' introduction to Burke's inquiry. We have thus arrived at a point from where we can address the perversions of libidinal love that are inextricably intertwined with the virtuoso's charismatic appeal, and here I'm borrowing the use of perversions from Renata Zalezel, whose arguments in Perversions of Love and Hate have influenced the following section. I forgot to include her in my handout, so I'm mentioning her here. The psychic life of virtuosity. One of the most potent legends surrounding Paganini was a tale that linked the musician's superhuman skill to the foundational trauma of murdering his lover and entering a pact with the devil, as is well known, I suppose. 19th century writer and artist Johann Peter Lüser, who is best known today through Heinrich Heine's praise of his drawings of Paganini, restages that legendary primal scene in his 1833 novella Fantasien aus D-Moll, Fantasies in D minor. Lüser extracts the murder from its usual presumed context at the court of Lucca in Italy and displaces it onto an altogether more fantastical scene, the forlorn heath at witching hour, where it acquires the aura of a haunting curse that weighs upon the violinist and condemns him to enact his crime over and over again. Cold, lonely, and motionless, Paganini is depicted as an undead revenant who only awakens after midnight when summoned by the forces of the underworld to give a nightly concert. Recalling in his music the pleasures and pains of his relationship with his lover, the woman finally arrives to sink down at the violinist's feet. Her declaration of love and innocence renders her former companion heartbroken. Admitting that after her alleged unfaithfulness, he had sworn to the devil to kill those whom he loves and received in exchange the latter's promise of superhuman virtuosity, Paganini is compelled to thrust his dagger in her heart. The early morning hours see him as God-forsaken as he was before the concert started. So this is the kind of very popular context, really, surrounding Paganini, restaged in that novella. What kind of drama is enacted then in the encounter between a public and a virtuoso whose charisma thrives on such Gothic fantasies? The insistence of the popular imagination on a traumatic subtext of passionate love as defining moment of Paganini's turn towards virtuosity suggests that his public is caught in the ritualized reiteration of a relationship just as passionate as the one it persists in conjuring up. The virtuoso needs to produce and sustain, that is, an effective attachment to his authority that keeps his audience under his spell. He must cast himself as a sublime figure whose violence becomes irresistible. And I'm talking about the cultural fantasies here, to be sure. Berg's inquiry was still troubled by the dilemma of how the sublime's power is actually to be explained if authority we respect, such as the sublime or the father, we do not love, and authority we love, such as beauty or the mother, we do not respect. For it's only love that will truly win us to the law, as Terry Eagleton argues in view of Berg, but this love will erode the law to nothing. Of course, that is to be contested. But while Berg may have denied in his argument the only solution to this dilemma, the potentially uneasy collusions of respect and love, the erotic empiricism of his discourse betrays the presence of such collusions in the inquiry, in the sense of both recollection and retraction. In The Cycle Life of Power, Judith Butler explains what she considers the irreducible character of the subject's implication within power structures by the primal attachments to those we depend on, those on whose power we rely to quite literally preserve our life. The inauguration of the subject is marked by an ambivalence that consists in a pleasure-filled relationship with subordination, which not only initiates and sustains agency, but also subordinates us. It is due to this uncomfortable double bind, Butler argues, that, I quote, no subject can emerge without this attachment, formed in dependency, but no subject in the course of its formation can ever afford fully to see it. It appears to be this kind of ambivalent love that erupts in the eroticization of the virtuoso. Butler's elaboration of a theory of attachment concentrates on foreclosure, according to which certain forms of love become possible and others impossible. For her, the foundational foreclosure that forms the right kind of attachment is not the bar against primary incestuous heterosexual desire, but against an even more primary homosexual object choice. For the purpose of the present paper, however, the theoretical focus remains on the core of Butler's argument between Freud and Foucault. The scandal here is not the exclusion of a specific type of object choice, but the fact that the subject enters into a passionate affair with the excluding agency as a force at once productive and prohibitive. Both the discourse on the sublime and the discursive and performative phenomenon of virtuosity can be seen as part of cultural practices and fantasies that seek to socialize and ritualize the subject's need to at once seek and shy away from its scandal of love for the master. This love for the master also affects the virtuoso master himself. His power must be seen as a type of subordination. This is precisely the formula that Theodor Adorno proposes in his brilliantly acute analysis of virtuosity, that is quote 6. Virtuosity, absolute mastery as play, absolute Herrschaft als Spiel, condemns the master at the same time to total impotence. In all virtuosity, including that of composition, the subject defines itself as a mere medium and so blindly subjects himself to what it aspires to subjugate. Unterwirft, verblendet sich dem, was zu unterjochen es sich vermisst. The more practice is mastered, the more fully subjection is achieved, argues Butler in her reading of Louis Althusser's Ideology and Ideological State Apparatuses. Although Althusser only begins to inquire into the strange love of the law that is so essential for the libidinal economy of the virtuoso, his focus on the acquisition of skills provides important cues for the performer's own dependency on that which empowers him. His training is a process where the acquisition of mastery implies submission to the rules of technique, obviously. Paganini's refusal to practice audibly in public, and we have lots of records of this refusal, can thus be seen as a myth-enhancing denial of the subordination that is at the root of his skill. The dialectic may have been given away, though, in the violinist's bodily performance. Butler suggests a negotiation of psychic and physical postures, of a psyche that turns against itself and a body in recoil. This may be an interesting complementary figure to what came up yesterday in the discussion of the creaturely cringe. A type of bending where the body seemed to draw away from an impacting force, but also find support, could have been among those difficult to chart physical markers of Paganini's performance that were potent creators of meaning. Schottky and others comment on the musician's peculiar countenance, whose mixture of attentiveness, submissiveness, and will to succeed bore fascination. Quoting, his body formed a kind of triangle during difficult passages as he contracts his torso in an exaggerated fashion, while his head and right foot are thrust forwards. The performer's affinity to the structures that ensnared his public adds a further layering of understanding to the extraordinary effectiveness of the imaginary construction of the murderer performer. The public was not only affected by a troubled scene of love, but also witnessed a performed pledge for acquittal. Heinrich Heine's perception of Paganini as someone whose concerts were an exercise in atonement is revealing. When he pays reverence to his audience before beginning to play, Paganini's face, I quote, had in it something so beseeching and bashfully modest. It was blödsinnig demütiges, writes Heine, such an imploring look, ein flehender Blick, which is, however, at once forgotten when the wondrous master turns to his music. The virtuoso's pleasure in turning to the law testifies to an earlier moment, before the murderer's guilt, where guilt is occasioned by the shameful position of the one who has not yet answered the call of the law, to become proficient in the technique that is imposed upon him. The following passage in Butler's Althusser essay inadvertently spells out the contours of the psychic life of virtuosity. Quotation 7. Submission to the rules of the dominant ideology, the ideology of musical technique, might then be understood as a submission to the necessity to prove innocence in the face of accusation, a submission to the demand for proof, an execution of that proof, and acquisition of the status of the subject in and through compliance with the terms of the interrogative law. To become a subject is thus to have been presumed guilty, then tried and declared innocent. Because this declaration is not a single act, but a status incessantly reproduced, to become a subject is to be continuously in the process of acquitting oneself of the accusation of guilt. It is to have become an emblem of lawfulness, an emblem of technical mastery, a citizen in good standing, but one for whom that status is tenuous indeed, one who has known somehow, somewhere, what it is not to have that standing, and hence to have been cast out as guilty. In this account, the virtuoso has to play for reasons other than to draw the money from his public's pockets. He has to play rather as he too has to love and derive pleasure from that which subjugates him, but also defines who he is, the subject of virtuosity. This double agency is also at work when a public not only submits to but is empowered with the virtuoso. Jonkiewicz emphasizes this process of identification between the public and the virtuoso as an important aspect of the performer's aura. Such is the effect of virtuoso charisma. By celebrating the triumph of the star, the audience fates in some way their own triumph. What attracts the audience to the virtuoso is undoubtedly his successful fulfillment of the laws of technique, but on a level beyond the possibility of failure that this technical successfulness still implies. Desire goes out to a more fundamental dynamic, embodied in the performer, a dynamic that will always achieve success. As Zaletzl argues in her Lacanian analysis of musical melodrama, the public desires someone for whom music making is a libidinal activity, someone obsessed with, devoted to, and potentially consumed by his drive. The satisfaction that drive will find constitutes the specific jouissance of the virtuoso, and one can read again in historical in the historical discourse that I'm not able to present today of types of self-enjoyment of the virtuoso. That's what made me, take that route. Where desire, also the desire for the virtuoso, must be linked to law. Drive transgresses law. It is an agency that does things whether they are willed or not, and thereby unleashes the painful satisfaction of jouissance. It is a fascination with and repulsion by this exceedingly solipsistic displeasure of the virtuoso, enthralled with his own performance, that people may have sensed when commenting on Paganini's stage persona's self-sufficient arrogance, or his equivocal occasional laughter, where it was not quite certain whether he laughed with or at the audience. Again, fascinating accounts of that. Drive grants a type of happiness still dependent on the other, but not any more concerned with this dependency, which accounts for its attractiveness for a public that paradoxically, by submitting to the virtuoso, also rises with him above those structures of submission upon which our social being depends. This kind of attraction, I would like to argue, is a fascination with the possibility of partaking in the potentially destructive jouissance of the virtuoso. Zaletzl follows Lacan's formulation of drive as something left over after the subject is incorporated in a symbolic structure. In Butler, drive too is liable to prohibition, doubled back upon itself, again the figure of recoil, and thereby becoming the precipitating condition of a subject defined by the reflective operation of conscience. While Zaletzl's definition of drive suggests possibilities of resistance outside the domain of the symbolic, Butler aims to understand what it means to construe resistance within the symbolic, or with Foucault as an effect of power. Although not taken up in Butler's argument, drive may constitute just such a turn of the law against itself. The virtuoso's fervently driven over-fulfillment of expectations does not escape the power structures upon which it is founded. Yet in its excessive nature, it represents a form of resistance. It is among what Butler calls unanticipated effects of symbolic interpolations, and therefore constitutes a form of subversion. Drive in the present scenario comes to sustain the symbolic order, but in such a hyperbolic way that it simultaneously undermines this order to point towards a refuge of self-indulgence. As will be shown in the final section of this paper, this remains a precarious operation, precarious performance. Judging from historical documents, it was interestingly the most perfect virtuoso, the most reliable master, who seemed to be lacking in the kind of charisma which makes a performer ultimately convincing. Notwithstanding the uncanny aura of the supremely functioning homme machine, those virtuosi who were most machinic also disappointed most. Heine is an eloquent hater of this type of virtuosity, of the victory of the machine over the mind, der Sieg des Maschinenwesens über den Menschen, or the human turned into instrument. The following passage contrasts such technical security with what the author deems truly masterful performances. Quotation 8. The more sober and heartless the violinist, the more uniform is his performance, and he can count on the obedience of his fiddle whenever and wherever he plays. But this praised security is not more than the result of imbecility, Beschränktheit in German, as the play of the greatest masters was not seldom dependent on outer and inner influences. Never have I heard anyone playing better than Paganini, but equally at certain times I have not heard anyone giving a worse performance than him. A precarious balance, a potential actual vulnerability is responsible for the charisma of the greatest masters, Heine claims. Jonkelewicz repeatedly lingers on the humanness of the virtuoso, on the horror of solitary exposure, and on the proximity of glory and fall. Debussy in Monsieur Croche contends that the virtuoso's attraction can be compared to the one that draws the masses towards the circus. One expects to see something dangerous. And Adorno writes, virtuosity and despair attract each other, for the former is always poised on the brink of failure, of plunging as if from the pinnacle of the circus tent. At each moment the virtuoso can make a slip, be ejected from the closed formation that the movement presents to the outside, aus der Geschlossenheit herausfallen. What emerges in the circus imaginary of Debussy and Adorno's observations, and in Jonkelewicz and Heine's emphasis on the human and the heart, is a concern with authenticity, with the fact that behind the artistic figure of the virtuoso there's a real person. Behind the perfectly functioning physical apparatus there's a fragile body. Paganini's physical appearance seems to have combined artistic figure and fragile body in a most intriguing way. His emaciated appearance gave evidence of a physique masked by death. And I think I have time for that quote, of if it consumed by and moving over into its devotion to technique. Schottky proposes the following characterization that complements the above-quoted characterization of the violinist's posture while playing. Quote 9. He's so thin that he could not possibly be any thinner. He hardly holds together in his clothes. And when he's taking his bows, his body moves in such strange ways that at any minute one fears for his legs to slip away under his torso and for the entire person to collapse into a heap of bones. Paganini appears to be the embodiment of technical capacity. Everything in him is passion. Nature would have made a mistake had she granted him more flesh. Again, cultural fantasy obviously around a very specific type of body marked by illness. The morbidity of this association of skill and passion points up the ultimate fantasy of charismatic authenticity, a virtuosic body of drive that not only permanently courts its own dissolution, but extinguishes itself at the moment of its greatest triumph, of becoming virtuosity as such. The realness of the fragile body is responsible for the potential culmination of the virtuoso subversive overachievement of the goals set out by the law-giving power, the regime of technique. The virtuoso's self-sacrificial drive is in the final instance always the death drive, and this drive appears to be among those instances of a desubjectivization that Butler explores with Foucault as the symbolic's own unanticipated subversions. Foucault speaks of a type of sacrificial resistance within the strategic field of power relations. The most spectacular dangers and desperations of virtuosity are not the constantly impending possibilities of fall and mistake then, but self-destructive overachievement. And it is in cultural fantasies of the virtuoso's death where this overachievement finds its fulfillment. Where, as Butler puts it, the law turns against itself and spawns versions of itself which oppose its animating purposes. Given the logic of our pleasure-filled attachment to the law, such turns must go beyond the pleasure principle. There are very fascinating 19th century literary examples. I'm just giving a very short, more recent one of the more recent versions of this fantasy. Klaus Kinski's last film, Kinski Paganini of 1989, stages the logic of musical drive that has to come to a lethal end most drastically. I put just one picture on the handout. Whereas the real Paganini died on 27 May 1840 in his bed in Nice after long illness, Kinski's Paganini literally plays himself to death with ever-increasing speed, ramming his violin into his sore and finally bleeding throat, which you can see on that photograph, until he collapses to the floor. Although this final performance finds a chance audience in Paganini's son and a small group of servants, it is not destined for a public, but takes place outside at the virtuoso's Nice residence. enacted in front of shocked witnesses, the emergence of the real in and through performance had been meant to remain in a place off stage, an obscene kind of uncompromising expenditure where self-indulgent becomes suicidal. Here, actual death only spells out the repetitive, self-inflicted injury, very literal injury in that Kinski image, of the virtuoso's fulfillment of the demands posed by the law of technique, the law of virtuosity. Paradoxically, this blind destructive insistence of the libido that Freud called the death drive recasts the power that constitutes the virtuoso as the power that he opposes. In the words of Butler, any mobilization against subjection will take subjection as its resource, and that attachment to an injurious interpellation will, by way of necessarily alienated narcissism, become the condition under which re-signifying that interpellation becomes possible. This will not be an unconscious outside of power, but rather something like the unconscious of power itself, in its traumatic and productive iterability. Thank you.
Some quick questions before we move on to the next two. Do you want to stay where you are?
I can stay here. That's fine.
Okay, questions. Thank you. Andrew.
Yeah, maybe a question. You said at the beginning that, Cathy Caruth's work, in a sense, is behind a lot of what you've done.
Yeah.
And with that in mind, I suppose I thought of, you used the German term Geisterbeziehung to talk about and translated that as a kind of control of minds.
Yes.
It could be understood as spirits. And what I was thinking about throughout really was the question of, because you talked about the sort of traumatic sort of act of the murder and the idea of a kind of, would there be a logic of the séance in virtuoso performance? Would there be a logic of the revenant, of a kind of haunted form of compulsive performance, I guess?
I'm interested in the cultural imaginary of the virtuoso, and certainly there is this aspect, and I could not go into this in the framework of this paper, but of course, for example, in Heine, the descriptions of how that works, that the virtuoso transposes his mind onto his audience, is a certain type of séance where he evokes images from his past, and they are then projected onto the minds of the audience. So it's very much, it follows very much this logic of the spectral.
And the medium came up in your discourse.
Yes, in Adorno. Yes, that's right. And there, of course, then is a link to repetition and the repetitiveness of the death drive that came up in the end. And again, obviously, this scenario that is embodied in Kinski, but also, for example, in the 19th century novella like Hans Christian Andersen's The Red Shoes, spells out the repetitive injury, of that virtuoso drive in very literal terms. But of course, it is a perpetual enactment in a sense. Yeah? So perhaps there are. Yeah.
I wondered if you could say a little bit of something about the way in which people thought about the composer vis-a-vis this performance practice. I mean, you said at one point that the true virtuoso causes you to identify him with the music.
Yeah.
But of course, there might be another person involved there. There might be the composer. How do people think about that?
Absolutely, a very important question, and that is. There's a lot of criticism of the virtuoso in the 19th century discourse, precisely because he seems to replace the composer, where the composer is, in fact, the real artist, the one who guards music as such. The performer is concerned with his own personality. So it's a very important point in the discourse, in the criticism of virtuosity. Wagner in Der Virtuos und der Künstler, for example, talks about that and compares composers to the ones, who are, the kind of the treasure deep down at the bottom of a Bergwerk. He has this romantic imagery of the Bergwerk is in
Mine.
yeah, of the mine, exactly. Whereas the virtuoso is the kind of the Katzengold, you know, the sparkle which you encounter on the way to the real, you know, the treasure of music. So obviously it's a huge issue in the historical discourse. Yeah. Yeah.
It's wonderful. Since the death drive is stumm, silent or dumb, mute, and eros is what we can see or hear. What does this have to do with how is music affected by the possibility of virtuosity in producing it? So what would be the link between the virtuoso and the music that he or she produces?
In relation to the death, again, that was so because death drive, of course, is this blind and stumm, that silent force, and of course, I was thinking on two different levels here. I mean, it's a fantastic question, but it's very complicated to answer because a death drive as a dynamic animates this. Well, paradoxically animates this music. Yeah. You know, there's a paradox here, I suppose. And I could only start to think about this in this, you know, by thinking through this paradox.
So I guess maybe without thinking of the stumm, just thinking about the music that's produced. So music can always be produced as or is it only some music? I guess it goes partly to the question of whether can all music be virtuosic or is it certain kinds of music?
Of course, there were, again, I mean, in the historical framework, there were obviously very, very explicit piece of virtuoso music, and Paganini himself composed, you know, he composed his own music, and his concerts, his recitals were based on either variations of other pieces of music or his own compositions in order to be able to draw out his skills. So there was this very specific type of virtuosic music, but obviously also there were, you know, Liszt, Thalberg, so many others. Of course, there were virtuoso ways of performing works of music too. So it's, you know,
Yeah, I'd like to come to this composition aspect, both what Cathy was saying, and also Rain was doing with referring to the composer. I think it has a relation back to Butler's notion of the subject, and not in quite the way that Butler would have intended.
Okay.
If you look at the actual compositions, the most virtuosic solo violin works of Paganini, like the later Caprices.
Yes.
You have a performance on the violin, usually of two different techniques of playing at the same time. Yeah. Almost as if there are two violins at work. Yeah. You know. So what I'm thinking here is, to the extent you've got Heine's account of this subject facing itself, but you've got Paganini's projection as if there is another subject playing at the same time. So the question then becomes about what constitutes the subject here, whether it's a splitting and the phantom is also somewhere else. There's always another phantom on stage performing, and the extent to which that means that, you know, it's no longer a question of guilt which constitutes the subject.
Okay.
You know, a guilt may be a way of trying to reify it as a single subject again, whereas Paganini's performance may already be a double subject.
Oh, that's okay. So there's also already this elsewhere that kind of undermines the concept of the subject that I've developed with Butler. Fascinating suggestion, which I think I can follow. And the composer here is that the composer, because you started from the issue of the composition.
For example, he would play a melodic line, but at the same time he's doing finger plucking with the other hand. Yeah. So that you've got two different ways, almost opposed ways of playing the violin. It's not a percussive instrument normally. Yeah. But you've got a melodic line being played by the bow, and then you've got this finger work
which was so fascinating to the audience.
So how does he play this?
Yeah.
And part of the whole projection was, how does he play it? Yeah. How can you play this much at the same time?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I take that up. Thank you.
Is the attachment to prohibition actually the enduriousness of the destructiveness of the death drive is precisely that you would be attached to injury? And that's in the language that
yes.
It seems to me that curiously we talk about music, but as I think the unity of the subject.
Yeah.
And finally, the machine.
Yeah.
Comes back. The machine, even the machine fails, collapses in bones. Pure technology, pure technique becomes the sort of collapse of the bone man. Yeah. So, in some sense, I think what you very beautifully showed was this peculiarity of this virtuosity is not mastery.
Yes.
It's whatever attraction there is to the reverse.
Yes.
Yeah.
That's very much. That's very much. That's the line of my argument. I think what I've tried. I try to make a distinction, though, between this idea of perfectly functioning technique, the machine man, and the driven over-fulfillment of technical demands of the virtuoso, which is to me a different kind of technicity.
And isn't there a difference between Heine saying I love the unevenness and the further quotation from Schotsky? And actually, Schotsky was writing, I'm not sure when he was writing. 1830. So, but who seemed to kind of get it, that actually this is about the way this sort of hyperbolic nature of the technical machinery isn't always liable to collapse. Yeah, so that's where the two come together again. Yeah, one could, of course, yeah. So the pure repetition, as it were, of the death rate, there's such a thing, pure repetition, but that it leads to this collapse even of the body. In this extraordinary sort of figure of the body, which is no longer even a body. Which I think you were talking about as the real, but actually it's kind of the de-real.
It's of course.
The blood of this maybe in the literal term.
Yes, exactly, and that's what I had in mind when I was talking of the real. That was in reference to Kinski's performance. Again, it's paradox. Your other argument, yes, of course, in this breaking down of the technical body, those two aspects of technicity, the reliable one and the technicity running wild, may then again come together. So I could see that. Although I wanted to, it is. I didn't have enough time, for my literary examples, because Heine makes a very clear distinction between the reliable technicity and, say, the unreliable one. But
sure.
Yeah.
I would love to
probably.
Is there one more question? Another question is there? No? I think we have to. Thank you. Okay, it's great to have Mr. Sternberg here, and Mr. Sternberg is working in fact on legal trials, refugee studies, and he is a professor of English at the University of Anglia, but has also written extensively on contemporary mid-20th century psychoanalysis and modern writing of that field, which is another modernist or postmodernist.
In between. Thanks, Mary. I was very perplexed, but also delighted to realise there'd been a kind of translation stumble. I thought that the title of the paper I'd given to Mary was The Perplexities of Refugee Speech. Somewhere, I don't know if it was me or the computer, it became Refugee Speak with a K. And it turned out that this reimposition of K has become very fortuitous, not only for this paper, but just alluding to the political context that Raymond began with, my own institution at the University of East Anglia was responding to cuts with what can only be described as a delighted embrace into the obscurities of institutional power. So the experience of K at the University of East Anglia has become very dear to us in the last 3 months. I want to just have a quote from Hannah Arendt again over the top of this paper, and it's from The Human Condition. She says, "A life without speech is literally dead to the world." I want to start, however, with a poem called Asylum by Mehmet al-Assad, written while he was detained as an illegal immigrant in the notorious Woomera camp in Australia. As some of you will remember, in January 2002, over 60 of Woomera's refugees sewed their lips together in protest against their imprisonment in the legal limbo of the camp, and part of the result of that, the camp was eventually closed down. Although compulsory detention is still obligatory for all refugees who arrive by boat in Australia. El Assad's poem was written as part of that protest, and its final stanza reads, "Through the wire, one last time, please observe, I am sewing my lips together, that which you are denying us, we should have never had to ask for." And I just asked him whether he wrote the poem originally in English and then translated it, or wrote it the other way around, but I haven't got an answer from him yet. In much of the commentary on this poem, El Assad's lines are read, not unreasonably, as a plea that the speaker's humanity be observed, and that with this, his rights as a human being be recognised too, that which he should never have had to ask for. The refugee poet, in other words, is assumed to be a kind of testifying supplicant, a ghost person, or a lyrical person, perhaps, after all, he's writing a poem, asking to be recognised as a legal person. But to my ears, that which is far trickier than this humanitarian reading, to adopt Joey Slaughter's phrase, implies. That which could be human rights, or, as its pronominal heaviness might suggest, could be something more elusive. As much as the lines run to a conclusion that the speaker be granted something that, because it is self-evidently his, the poem shows us so, he should never have had to ask for, the line breaks introduce a hesitation, almost a stutter or series of pauses, into that passage from lyrical to legal personhood. That which you are denying us, we should never have had to ask for. What is revealed in that stutter, possibly, is less, or at least not only, the human being that the poem gives the illusion is there waiting to be granted his rights, than a voice mourning an absence. Note, for example, how the line, we should never have, pauses for a moment, resting on the possibility of an entire life without rights. A non-humanitarian, if that's quite the right phrase, I'm not sure it is, reading of El Assad's lines, in other words, might conclude that it is precisely that which, of which he is denied, of which he should never have had to ask, that the speaker is calling into question. This reading would make the speaker less a supplicant to rights withheld than a stranger who, precisely because he speaks from the position of the stateless from within the camp, comes with a perhaps more difficult message about what it might mean to speak of human rights in the first place. Now, the difficulty of staking, let alone speaking, a claim to rights on the mere fact of being human was, of course, at the heart of Hannah Arendt's famous critique of human rights. Quote, "The paradox involved in the loss of human rights," she wrote in a much-quoted passage, chapter 9 from The Origins of Totalitarianism, "is that such a loss coincides with the moment a person becomes a human being in general." So the paradox involved in the loss of human rights is that such loss coincides with the moment a person becomes a human being in general. Rather than being a foundation for rights, being human is all that is left after political, national and civic rights have been stripped away. But how, and this is the question that drives my paper, is that paradox to be spoken? And this is where I come, this is a literary critic, not a philosopher. Appeals to the humanity of the refugee, as I've just tried to suggest, tend to conceal that paradox within the being humanness, so to speak, of testimony. But what happens if instead we dwell on those moments when, as in El Assad's poem, refugee speech exposes the difficulty of deriving humanity, and so rights, from speech? So the bigger question I'm trying to think my way into here, and this is part of the project I've just started, is whether it's possible to link Arendt's critique of the anthropological foundation of rights to a parallel critique of the assumed anthropomorphism of literary language, particularly that used in refugee testimony. This is new work, and I'm beginning to think, the more I look at refugee testimony, as something different is happening in human rights testimony, which often takes the form of a demand for future rights or absent rights, than what happens with testimony, to evoke Cathy's work again, to a past trauma or injury. With traumatic testimony, it's often the relationship, as Cathy's shown in her lecture last night, between language and history that's put on trial. Whereas in human rights testimony, it's the relationship between language and humanity that's foregrounded. And hence, this is completely speculative. Possibly, I think, the tendency you have in testimony to borrow very heavily from lyric, an emphasis on individual feeling, passion, and human suffering. That's the bigger context with which I'm trying to think some of these issues through. But today I just want to come at some of these issues more simply by looking at three texts that Hannah Arendt wrote in the mid-1940s. So I want to begin again with a kind of similar stutter or stumble in that passage from lyrical to legal personhood that we saw in El-Hassad's poem, that occurs in Arendt's fiercely protesting 1943 essay, We Refugees, which was first published in the Menorah Journal. Edgy, angry, fiercely ironic, Arendt's writing in this, to my mind, quite extraordinary essay enacts linguistically the very political and legal unhousing against which she protests. Quote, we lost our language, she writes, which means the naturalness of reaction, the simplicity of gestures, the unaffected expressions of feeling. We lost the right to lyric, we might read Arendt as saying here. But rather than succumbing to the verbal gaucheness of the stranger, Arendt instead drives a calculated linguistic distance in her essay by writing, for the most part, in free indirect speech. Citing, not inhabiting her own thoughts and those of her fellow refugees, the we is really heavily freighted in this essay. Ducking and diving between, to use her famous terms, the affectation of the parvenu, who would attempt to assimilate, and the protesting irony of the pariah. Listen, and this is the first Arendt quote on your handout, to this scathing parody of the self-deluding linguistic compliance of the immigrant refugee. Quote, with the language, however, we find no difficulties. After a single year, optimists are convinced they speak English as well as their mother tongue, and after 2 years they swear solemnly that they speak English better than any other language, though German is a language they hardly remember. This is no mere desperate forgetfulness, this bid to new linguistic existence. Feigning to forget one's language, Arendt suggests in the very next paragraph, is part of the way the parvenu refugee conceals both the recent past and their unique status, precisely as, and we're moving close again here to the paradox of human rights, a mere human being. The very next paragraph reads, quote, in order to forget more efficiently, we rather avoid any allusion to concentration or internment camps. How often have we been told that nobody likes to listen to all that? Apparently, nobody wants to know that contemporary history has created a new kind of human beings, the kind that are put in concentration camps by their foes and internment camps by their friends. Forgetting, I think we go back to Cathy's lecture again last night, forgetting as historical erasure, apparently. But what nobody wants to know, the fact that history has created a new kind of being whose humanity is defined precisely through his statelessness, also rudely reveals itself, makes itself present as a form of grammatical awkwardness, a new kind of human beings. This is Arendt's, I think, pause or stumble, and it's been rightly retained in all subsequent editions of the essay. Eine neue Art Mensch, in the singular you could say in German, but equally you might say eine neue Art Mensch, which sounds like a plural to English ears, but is actually a genitive singular, a new kind of human. There's a stumble here, I think, in Arendt's self-translation from the genitive, as you'd have it in the German, and the jarring plural that ends up in the English. And it's exactly the kind of stumble that a stranger makes in a new language. It's significant, or perhaps witty enough, that this half-back translation occurs just after Arendt has admonished her fellow refugees for pretending to forget their native tongue, kind of performs what it says. More poignant still, I think, is the fact that Arendt trips up on the very category that parvenu is anxious to disguise in her new language, the new human beings created by contemporary history, the radically rightless, the refugee, the camp inmate, who are stuck, as it were, between German and English in the same way as they are suspended in legal and political limbo. So how then can we read this stumble from a stranger? One conclusion we might want to draw at this point is that Arendt's refugee speech, with its distancing and stuttering, exposes not only the totally unprotected new kind of human beings, but also a profound gap or wound, to invoke Cathy's work on trauma, between these lost persons and speech itself, as if to be lost in language is to be lost to rights, or as though, perhaps even more tragically, to be deprived of lyric is no longer to echo the human whose rights are supposed by the law. In any case, Arendt seems a long way here from the testimony through which the refugee might claim her rights on the grounds of a lyrically derived humanity. And what pathos there is in her essay, and this is one of the most moving pieces, I think, that she wrote in this period, resembles more perhaps the pathos of a suited mouth to recall the similarly politically motivated irony of Women's Refugees. I'm also drawn at this point, but it's a path I want to take in order to turn back from, or perhaps in order to stumble across, to Paul de Man's famous description of Walter Benjamin's essay, The Task of Translator, which is, I can feel like is echoed in We Refugees, another key text about language loss and authority. Quote, Benjamin's language of pathos, de Man once said, quote, the pathos of exile and so on and so forth, really describes linguistic events which are by no means human. To the extent that Benjamin's essay is human, for a man unsurprisingly all too human, it displaces our sense of what is human both in ourselves and in our relation to other humans. Something similar, one might be tempted to say, might be said about the new kind of human beings that emerge so precariously in the between of languages, linguistic events of Arendt's We Refugees. But that displacing of the sense of what is human, for Arendt at least, is at least as political as it is linguistic. Actually, I think in the end it's far more so, and not only because of that very prevalent sense of historical immediacy you get in Arendt's writing in the 40s. And while there is indeed, I think, a very intimate correlation between her denaturalizing of the anthropomorphism of the testimonial voice, and by her use of irony, and her critique of the anthropological foundation of human rights, in this text at least, it does not follow in the long term for Arendt that these new kind of human beings vanish altogether from either politics or speech. Rather, if Arendt refuses the pathos of testimony in her 1943 essay, I think this is because she was also beginning to think about a different relationship between political rights and a speech of a figure who she also calls in the 1940s the Jew stranger. Now, the model for the Jew stranger is, as some of you will have guessed about 20 minutes ago, Kay from Kafka's Castle. Arendt published twice on Kafka in 1944. That's 1 year after We Refugees. First as part of the essay The Jew as Pariah in Jewish Social Studies, and second in more depth in her revaluation on the 20th anniversary of his death, the Partisan Review. There are also two quite different German versions of those two essays published in 1946. In the first discussion, in The Jew as Pariah, The Castle is described, quote, as the only novel of Kafka's in which the hero is plainly a Jew, whereas in the Partisan essay, K is simply presented as the rightless stranger, which would suggest that linguistic unease, and not only linguistic, between parvenu and pariah in the Refugees essay had far from played itself out 1 year on. In Arendt's version of The Castle, both the Jewish K and the not-so-obviously Jewish K enter the world which she claims is that of the earlier The Trial. In this world, she says, we're condemned both to the judicial caprice of bureaucratic machinery and, to go back to our earlier discussion, to what Arendt calls, quote, the lying necessity and necessary lying as divine law. So the lying necessity and necessary lying as divine law that supports that apparatus. Kay, the Jew stranger of the castle, I think might be one of the first witnesses, to go back to your question, Cathy, about how to witness the history of the lie, the first witnesses of the history of the modern lie in Arendt's reading. This might also be why Arendt's case foremost a human rights activist. He is a newcomer to the village who simply wants to claim his rights. He speaks, she writes, quote, for the average small-time Jew who really wants no more than his rights as a human being, home, work, family, citizenship. What makes Kay strange in this respect is not only the fact that he comes from outside the village. What makes him really strange is the fact that, quote, he's the only normal and healthy human being in a world where everything human and normal, love and work and fellowship, has been wrested out of man's hands to become a gift endowed from without. This is what makes his speech, his right speech, so conspicuous. Arendt writes, Kay's aspiration, far from being commonplace and obvious, is in fact exceptional and scandalous. He puts up a fight for the minimum as if it were something which embraced the sum total of all possible demands. For the villagers, Kay's strangeness consists not in his being deprived of the essentials of life, but in his asking for them. Okay, his strangeness consists not in his being deprived of the essentials of life, but in his asking for them. By asking for his rights, Kay exposes a system in which what passes for rights are in fact no more than favours granted to subjects by sovereign power. Kay rejects the trade between being granted citizens' rights and agreeing to be an agent of the castle. With that rejection, he reveals himself precisely as, we might say, a representative of Arendt's new kind of human beings, not only because he's a superfluous and irritating stumbling irrelevance, as the villagers tend to treat him, trapped in legal limbo, but because his stubborn persistence reveals the fact that rights are neither inalienable nor grounded in humanity, but only as real as the sovereign power that grants them. But at least as telling as Kay's refugee activism, however, at least for the argument I'm trying to explore here, is the kind of actor and speaker that Kafka makes him. The striking feature of Kafka's characters for Arendt is the way they pointedly, as she puts it, quote, have little to do with that modern complication of the inner life, which is always looking out for new and unique techniques to express new and unique feelings. So little to do with that modern complication of the inner life, which is always looking out for new and unique techniques to express new and unique feelings. No ostentatiously nouveau lyricism here, then, and for good reason, for to cast Kay as a complicated human character who demands his rights on the basis of that complicated inner life would be to miss entirely the critique of rights that Kafka, or more accurately Arendt, is making here. It's not on the grounds of his already existing humanity that Kay makes his appeal to the castle, but in the name of, quote, an ideal of humanity, in a kind of reverse Platonism, that exists for Kay, the Jew stranger, and for Kafka, the pariah and fabricata mundi, the writer of fictional worlds. So if Kay is a stripped-down kind of literary being, lacking, as Arendt puts it, quote, the many superfluous detailed characteristics which together make up a real individual, this is because, like his maker, he is not of the world he lives in. For to be real in such a world would be to be complicit in the history of the lie, which I might say makes him the witness. In other words, Kay is not human in a conventional literary sense because the world in which he could be so is absent. When Kay stubbornly insists on, quote, nothing more than the inalienable rights of man, it's not because such rights exist and he wants them, but precisely because they don't. This is also why he pointedly fails to be moved by the testimonies of suffering told by practically every villager he encounters. To accept such testimonies, Arendt argues, would be to accept the magic that turns narratives of political injustice at the hands of the castle into folk tales about fate. And I really like that reading because you have a notion of testimony as actually being a depoliticisation of suffering, rather than it's tended to be looked at today, both in judicial and in literary discourses, the generic means to suffering's end. This is also perhaps why the castle ends, or breaks off mid-sentence, not with the shame of the previous Kay of the trial, who dies as he concedes to the power of the lie, but with exhaustion. In the end, writes Arendt, the fight of the stranger had no other result than him being an example. His story, his behaviour, teaches the villagers, quote, that human rights are worth fighting for, and that the rule of the castle is not divine law, and consequently can be attacked. He has made them see, as they put it, that men who suffered our kind of experiences, who are beset by a kind of fear, who tremble at every knock at the door, cannot see things straight. And they had, how lucky you are, how lucky are we that you came to us. If you read The Castle, it's difficult to sustain this reading. But I'm actually staying within Arendt, not Arendt as an accurate reader of Kafka. As Howard Kegel has argued recently, making Kay into a negative example of a human ideal puts Arendt very much in the tradition that reads Kafka in terms of his redemptive aesthetic. And I'm thinking here too of Sebald's messianic reading of The Castle. In this sense, the rights of the new human beings who emerge precariously between the languages of we refugees are rights yet to come, to echo Derrida's justice yet to come. In another sense, however, the historical immediacy that pushes through the pages of we refugees follows Arendt through to her writing on Kafka in the 1940s. Quote, if we should start telling the truth that we are nothing but Jews, Arendt had written at the end of We Refugees, in one of the very few passages not written in indirect speech, it would mean that we expose ourselves to the fate of human beings who, unprotected by any specific law or political convention, are nothing but human beings. So, yeah, if we should start telling the truth that we're not just refugees, we're Jews, it would mean that we expose ourselves to the fate of human beings who, unprotected by any specific law or political convention, are nothing but human beings. It was, she writes of Kafka, precisely because he perceived that there was no place for the Jew to live simply as a normal human being, that he became a reluctant Zionist, she implies. The project of nation building, however, no more solved the problem of the contingency of rights than Kafka's world-building fiction. In the context of her bitter and ironic acceptance of Burke's argument that human rights were a flimsy substitute for those granted by the nation-state, in Chapter 9 of Origins, Arendt would later remark that, quote, far from solving the problem of the stateless, the foundation of Israel, quote, like virtually all other events of the 20th century, merely produced a new category of refugees, the Arabs, she says. And we go back here to where I started, in more historical senses than one. And so to conclude, if Al-Assad's poem flips between making its speaker's humanity a ground for claiming rights and profoundly questioning any existing association between speech, rights and humanities, this is not least because he's living the paradox that Arendt first identified in the 1940s. Al-Assad and his fellow camp inmates knew as well as did Arendt and Kafka, rights exist only insofar as they are granted by the nation-states. Rights do not travel with human beings. Finally, that is the unsentimental message of the refugee, Jew stranger, Arab stranger. Quote, will you please observe through the wire, read the first lines of Asylum, I am sewing my feet together, they have walked about as far as they ever need to go. Thanks.
I wanted to begin this paper with quite emphatic inauguration in the form of a question, but given that it's about complicated beginnings in some sense, I realised how inappropriate that would be. And happily, last night, that beginning was complicated for me when I was sitting next to my friend Lucia during Professor Caruth's lecture, and Lucia asked this fantastic question about the place of Zoe in Jensen's Gradiva, and I was sitting there thinking, that was my question. I wish I'd asked that. So, in which case, I do want now to return to that question and to ask it again, and this is the question. What is life? And in particular, is this question even one for which we can hope ever to have an answer? I want to begin to approach these connected questions, or rather the large question, the one that nestles within it, through recourse to a response to them which refuses to give a readily portable answer, but which I think much more valuably gives the sharpest possible sense of what one might call their constitutively enigmatical nature. This, of course, is Cathy Caruth's reading of Freud's account of the emergence of life in Beyond the Pleasure Principle, which she talked about again last night, in which she discerns Freud's insight into, and this is a quotation from Unclaimed Experience, the peculiar incomprehensibility of human survival. This is where I wish to begin then, before moving on to offer a reading of a little remarked lyric of Percy Shelley's. And in that turn, I wish again to invoke another of Professor Caruth's insights, this time into the characteristically literary disturbance of putatively explicit and transparent statement. And I'd like to say at this moment that I'm acutely aware of the dullness of the rather mechanical contrivance of providing one's audience in advance with a scale model of one's talk, but such procedural good manners, I would like to think, at least have the advantage of forestalling any traumatic fright that my little talk might otherwise risk. Professor Caruth has developed her reading of Freud's account of the emergence of life in Beyond the Pleasure Principle in two characteristically tenacious texts, in particular in the chapter Traumatic Departures from Unclaimed Experience, and in her, to my mind, rather moving reflection on the consequences of random youth violence in the city of Atlanta in the essay Parting Words from the collection Acts of Narrative. This is how Freud accounts for the awakening of life, given here in Professor Caruth's modification of the Standard Edition's translation. This is the first quotation on the handout, which I hope you can all see. The attributes of life were at some time awoken in inanimate matter by the action of a force of whose nature we can form no conception. The tension which then arose in what had hitherto been an inanimate substance endeavoured to cancel itself out. In this way, the first drive came into being, the drive to return to the inanimate state. The claim here on which Professor Caruth's reading especially focuses, or at least for my purposes especially focuses, is the claim that life comes with no warning, benefits from no preparation, and that any retrospective insight into its origin is frustrated. Life is marked by a radical absence of knowledge of its origins, as Professor Caruth remarks again from Unclaimed Experience. The origin of the drive is thus precisely the experience of having passed beyond death without knowing it. This point is made with renewed emphasis in Parting Words, and this is also on the handout the following quotation. Life itself is an imperative to awaken that precedes any understanding or consciousness and any possible desire or wish. The witness of survival itself, the awakening that constitutes life, lies not only in the incomprehensible repetition of the past, that is, but in the incomprehensibility of a future that is not yet owned. This imperative, it's important to emphasize again, is neither conceptually nor volitionally formed, and so it is, we might say, radically imperious, in that there is no agency which might choose either to assent to or dissent from it. Life, then, is neither the result of a desire or wish, nor does it conform to a pre-established idea of it. Life is thus an enigma, not, or at least not entirely, because it is intractable in terms of consciousness, but because it itself contains the possibility, but rather also because it contains the possibility of a kind of survival that exceeds its origin and which thus distinguishes life from death. It is not only the threat of death that is ungraspable by consciousness, but the very survival of that threat itself. And this is from Unclaimed Experience. For consciousness, survival does not seem to be a matter of known experience at all. Thus, the characteristic movement of life is not only backward in the attempt to recover its unrecoverable origin, but forward into a future that it equally cannot know in advance. And from Parting Words, the departure into life is not simply the awakening that repeats an original death, but an act of parting that distinguishes precisely between death and life. That was under the second heading. Significantly, therefore, this act of parting in distinguishing itself from its origin in death is a creative act which bears witness, and this is on the handout here, and this is out of reading of Freud's account of the Fort Da game, which I can't go into here, but that's where it's from, which bears witness to the past even by turning from it, bears witness to death by bearing witness to the possibility of origination in life. History here is reclaimed and generated not in reliving unconsciously the death of the past, but by an act that bears witness by parting from it. The language of the life drive does not simply point backward, that is, but bears witness to the past by pointing to the future. The death of the past here, then, is both the past's death and a death that belongs in the past. But life is the reliving of neither of these. It is not death warmed up. So, life's movement is a paradoxical return and advance, which brief recapitulation brings me nicely forward to the short and overlooked poem by Shelley that I want to examine, which, as one of that poet's many experiments with the form of terza rima, precisely bears witness to its own past, even by turning from it, as I shall hope to explain. But it is necessary first to introduce some words of caution concerning this kind of apparent transition to the literary, because Cathy Caruth's work contains powerful testimony to the fact that literature is not a pre-decided body of texts upon which a criticism, however well informed by doctrine from empiricism to psychoanalysis, conducts its experiments. Much rather, I think, books such as Empirical Truths and Critical Fictions and Unclaimed Experience, which I've already talked about a bit, show that the literary precisely disturbs the doctrinal in a way that can never be simply anticipated in advance. Thus it is that large categories of intellectual history, such as empiricism, are reshaped by precise attention to the texts in which they are apparently expressed, although that word expressed can no longer be the right word for what we mean here if we understand it uncomplicatedly. So, for example, the burden of the reading of Locke's essay concerning human understanding in Professor Caruth's Empirical Truths and Critical Fictions was to show how, and I quote again, empirical arguments work by a sort of slippage from analytical distinctions to empirical narratives. I hope it's not irritating having yourself quoted in this way. No, okay, good. It is precisely the role of language that affects this slippage, and this is the third section now on your handout. This disturbance of doctrine by story marks the intrusion of language into the self-contained territory of understanding, which had thought to establish itself in the transparency of self-contemplation. The functioning of formal literary features in the language of reflection, such as narrative and figure, creates a distance of interpretation between the understanding and itself, and between our understanding and this understanding. Indeed, then, this is precisely not the imposition of a theoretical framework, nor the pursuance of an established methodology for the reading of literature. For, as the introduction to Unclaimed Experience declares, and I quote, "Literature, like psychoanalysis, is interested in the complex relation between knowing and not knowing." Moreover, it is not simply that this interest takes place in literature, but much rather that literary language is itself, and I quote, "a language," and this is on the handout, "a language that defies, even as it claims, our understanding," or a language that defies, even as it claims, our understanding. What I want to suggest then is that literature's defiant insistence on and insistent defiance of knowledge allies it with life in its recursion to a lost past and opening onto an unprepared future. The at once backward and forward movement of life is crucial to literature's interest in the relation of knowing and not knowing. And I want further to suggest that in the poem of Shelley's I want us to look at now, the movement of recursion and propulsion that its verse enacts is crucially related both to what the poem knows and to what we can know about it. Let us turn to the poem itself. Here are the mere 9 lines, written probably in 1818 in one of Shelley's many notebooks. "Alas, this is not what I thought life was. I knew that there were crimes and evil men, misery and hate, nor did I hope to pass untouched by suffering through the rugged glen. In mine own heart I saw as in a glass the hearts of others. So, and when I went among my kind with triple breasts of calm endurance, my weak heart I armed, to bear scorn, hate and fear, a woeful mass." Initially, the poem does seem to envisage a moment of preparation for life, a preconception of what it will be, directly contrary to what Freud, as Professor Caruth has shown, imagines. There was a thought of life before life itself could confirm or deny it. That thought, it would seem, is a thing of the past, which is emphasised by the apocopation of would be at the line's conclusion. So this is not what I thought life would be, in was, a was that has been rendered null by what life is. After the opening lament, the poem then turns in its second line to explain that lament, that is, to narrate its cause. It soon becomes clear, though, that the poem's narrative is not going to provide an explanation of what the poet thought life was at all. What we would expect here is an account of the contrast between the thought of life, the lineaments of which are yet to be sketched, and the facts of life themselves. But it is precisely when the brief narrative of this short poem develops that the thought of life that has been disappointed by life recedes from rather than comes into view, although this is a recession that crucially stops short of sheer disavowal of the possibility that life might be thought differently from how it transpires. The second line is concerned not, in fact, with what was thought of life, but what was, indeed, contrastingly known of it. One might emphasise at this point the distinction between thought and knowledge that Immanuel Kant's philosophy had insisted upon shortly before this poem was written. Thought is distinguished from knowledge in that we may think what we like, more or less, but only ever know what is actually the case. But such a distinction is precisely blurred here, because as the poem turns from the complaint of its first line, we learn not what the poet thought of life, but rather that some of this thought was knowledge that has not been refuted, but instead confirmed by life. I knew that there were crimes and evil men. And it is worth saying again that this is precisely not the knowledge that the opening line encourages us to expect. What we expect to learn is how the poet's thought was mistaken, but we learn instead how it was in fact accurate and thus constitutes knowledge. We should be told that he thought life was a bed of roses, but we learn that he knew it was a vale of tears all along. The poem bemoans the fact not so much that life has failed to live up to the expectations of the one living it then, but rather that it has turned out all too much as expected, full of crimes, evil men, misery, and hate. At no point do we, in fact, learn, though, the pre-existing thought of life that life itself has disproved. At no point do we hear of any conception of life that would not be gleaned from the experience of life itself anyway, and thus establishable as knowledge. Such knowledge here is surreptitiously cast back onto an original pre-animate state of which we here actually do not learn. Is it then that the thought of life was a chimera all along, that then was no thought of what life is? And does the absence of this thought show that what there is all that there is, and that no thought of anything otherwise is in fact at all conceivable? Are we simply to settle with the fact of loss? The poem, I think, invokes another possibility. It is not that the thought of life is simply lost in an absent past, covered over by a supervening knowledge of what life in fact is. Rather, the possibility of the difference of this thought from what we know of life does not only fail to grasp life in its origin, but opens up a different future for life. The possibility of this fragile thought, and Shelley is, I would like to suggest, one of our most significant poets of fragility, of weakness, of frailty even. And this, I think, is the truth moment in Leavis's dismissal of him as an adolescent poet with a weak grasp upon the actual. That's the true bit of that statement. The possibility of this fragile thought, to borrow the conclusion from Professor Caruth's reading of Arendt's account of political lying, is not necessarily a promise, life cannot be anticipated, but rather testimony to the possibility of another history. The poem thus complicates the apparent transparency of understanding to itself of what its thought of life was, in the way that Professor Caruth's radical rereading of the intellectual and literary history after John Locke in Empirical Truths and Critical Fictions showed. But she also implied in that text that that obscuring of transparency was accompanied by an opening of understanding's self-closure. This poem likewise returns to but cannot grasp the original thought of life, not in order to offer the reassuring consolation of life's complete emptiness, but rather to open the possibility that life might be otherwise, that there might be, in Professor Caruth's resonant phrase, another history or a new survival. How does it do this? I want to come at one answer to this question by examining the precise nature of the poem's fragmentariness. The Longman edition of Shelley's poems is confident that the poem is indeed fragmentary, calling it the present fragment in its headnote. But is that fragmentariness complete in its refusal of completion on the one hand? And what sorts of completion might the lines wish for on the other? We need here, I think, to turn not to the poem's narrative, which incidentally might also be said not to have ended just as it refuses to articulate its beginning, but to its verse form. The poem is written, as I've mentioned, in terza rima, the rhyme scheme, as many of you know, of Dante's Commedia, but also of a number of significantly unfinished poems by Shelley, including his Prince Athanase, the Immortal Prince, and The Triumph of Life. Terza rima, like blank verse or heroic couplets, presents a specific challenge, although different challenge to the challenges that they present, specific challenge to completion, because the scheme of its interlinking tercets, ABA, BCB, CDC, so on, is potentially infinite. But note that the usual scheme of terza rima is not the scheme of this poem. Rather than passing forward the bracketing rhymes of the preceding stanza ever on to the following stanza, Shelley returns here to the rhymes of the very first tercet, so that the scheme here is ABA, BAB, ACA. Trying to make rhyme schemes sound exciting. Anyway, moreover, that A rhyme on was, pass, glass, etc. itself returns to the poem's very first word, alas. I think there's something interesting to be said, by the way, which I haven't quite formulated for myself, but I'll float it past you anyway, about the interaction of one understanding of language and what I might like to call emphatical language and the possibilities of that interaction, not least because the poem's initiation in the word alas is a word that isn't entirely a word in some sense. Its etymology traces it to the plaintive yoked to the verbal lassus for weariness. So it's a conjunction of an emphatical particle, if you like, with a lexical item. And that's especially significant, I think, because of the fact that I've just pointed out, that the rhymes that the poem cannot seem to let go of are then there right at the beginning, where rhymes shouldn't be, to be returned to again and again at the ends of lines. But it's also worth mentioning that the very first rhyme word was fits ill with the rhyme words that follow it, pass, glass, etc. And I'm acutely conscious here, I'm reminded of a moment that Mark Redfield records in his appendix to Legacies of Paul de Man, when he records this anecdote about de Man lecturing on the triumph of life and his incapability of pronouncing the difference between tread and thread, on which his entire reading, as Mark Redfield nicely puts it, was hanging. And I'm aware that my Mancunian way of pronouncing this poem of was and pass is probably quite different from an Eton-educated member of the Sussex gentry's way of pronouncing it, was and pass. Actually, I don't think it makes that much difference. It's still ill-fitting, those rhymes. The substantial point is that ill-fitting only becomes transparent after the beginning, even though it's a beginning that's ill-fitting, which is then rendered ill-fitting by what comes after it. So you don't know that it's going to turn out wrong at the start. You only know that subsequently when you're looking back. That's a kind of longish aside, so thank you for indulging it. The fragmentariness of the poem's form betokens not a lack of completion at its end, a tailing off into infinity that would only be brought to completion by an arbitrary decision to stop it in one way or another, but rather an insistent returning to its beginning. On the one hand, then, we might say that this poem refuses ever to begin. On the other hand, it nevertheless has initiated a form whose possibilities for development are unlimited. The poem confronts life with triple brass of calm endurance, the triple brass, of course, of its terza rima form, that endures despite the absent past that the poem attempts to but cannot re-describe. And this is my conclusion. At the conclusion of her first book, Empirical Truths and Critical Fictions, Professor Caruth shared what was, for her, the attraction of Locke's essay, Wordsworth's Prelude, Kant's Metaphysical Foundations, and Freud's Beyond the Pleasure Principle set of texts. I think it's worth noting that is hardly derived from any pre-established view of literary or intellectual history, saying, and this is the final quotation, "What, in my view, is so compelling in these authors is that they refuse to leave us with the reassuring negativity of loss. They show us rather how, on the one hand, the locating of this loss is the very aim of thought and the very origin of its power, and how not knowing, on the other hand, is both constitutive of negative thinking and also fundamentally disruptive of it. The compulsion testified to here is one both to return to an origin and to turn from it into a new kind of survival. In calm endurance is for sure no promise, but the testimony to the possibility of human history, which would exceed that woeful mass from which life emerges." Thank you.
Can I ask two really naive questions of Professor Stonebridge? One is, in your paper, there were several instances of, as it were, the rejection of classical ideals of fluid speech and ideals of human virtue, human citizenship depending on fluid speech. And so you have examples of a person who is sewing their lips together, who's silent, and then Hannah Arendt, who makes a grammatical mistake in English, so there's there's silence, there's solecism, and then you use the example of stuttering. And I wondered whether you saw there to be anything significantly common in those three ways of failing to be a fluid Ciceronian speaker, or whether you just thought that they were just accidental features. That was the first question. The second one was about Ka. Why do you think he's not moved by any of the villagers' stories?
Oh, I think he is.
Oh,
that's
right. Sorry.
Yeah. I don't think. I mean, that's why her reading is quite emphatically. I mean, I don't think it is actually a kind of reading of the castle I recognise. Okay. I think he is, and that's why he keeps on listening, and he kind of almost compulsively has to listen to these stories.
That's my mistake.
But it's her. Yeah, no, that's what. But she wants to do that because she wants to claim something about the naturalisation of suffering. So that's why she's being heavy-handed, I think, with that reading.
So routinization of the naturalisation.
Yeah. And she, I mean, she's coming off her reading of The Storyteller as well. Sort of what happens when a story becomes, rather than a story of historical violence, a story of fate, folklore. And she talks about those stories as they're told like fairy stories and folk tales, but she says that there's a resistance to that. I don't think there is, but I think I can see why she wants there to be. Your question about that kind of block on speech, I'm still puzzling through because I kind of think there is something significant there, but I don't want to rareify them either, if you see what I mean, and turn speechlessness into another form of silence, which, sorry, I can't believe I just said that, but you see what I mean, to kind of retain something of the awkwardness on it. So I have tried to write before on lip sewing, and I just thought, actually, I can't do this. I don't know where to put it. I don't know if I've got the right to do it. It's not the same as a stutter and a stumble, but all of them do speak to that kind of disruption of the assumption between humanity and speech in different context-specific ways, I'd say, but maybe there's a beginning of a genealogy in which you could put them together, but I haven't got there yet.
Can I say something about it's a really beautiful reading. I was just thinking about your interesting comment about linking the questioning of the rights based on an anthropology of the human, I think you said something like that, and a notion of the lyric based on anthropomorphism in which the human would be assumed, I guess, as pre-existing, and then projected into the poem. And so I'm thinking of Demon's notion of prosopopea, where the figure was behind the latter comment, as the production of a face. And that is also the defacement or disfiguration of the face through the literary, through language, but particularly literary language, because the sewing together, you have feet and then a heart.
With ashes.
And then lips. What?
With ashes.
With ashes, too. I'm going to bracket that. It's so tempting. But first, the sewing of the feet and the sewing of the heart and the sewing of the lips. And thinking of the analysis where he talks about, in the beginning of the Wordsworth, the Blessed Babe passage of the Wordsworth, where the mother's face, the child, at first would appear to be in a specular relation to the mother's face, on the breast of the mother, presumably looking at the eye, but actually is producing the mother's face. So on the one hand, I mean, the sewing you talk about as, first of all, as sewing is not speaking, but the sewing, the various parts being sewn together is also a kind of, making, kind of like, the production of a figure here that's also a disfiguration at the same time. So it seems to capture and what you're trying to talk about here, because you both produce and disfigure at the same moment. And also, that made me think, were you suggesting in terms of lyric, the right to lyric, that lyric is also a site that is also anti-lyrical to the extent that it questions, at least in anthropomorphism or in wrongly understood prosopopea. Is that?
Yeah, I mean, I think the essay that I started with was Barbara Johnson's fantastic essay on anthropomorphism in lyric and law.
Yes.
But as I was looking at that, I realised that her version of law was very much American constitutional law, and what was happening with what happens in Arendt is the kind of coming, the block on national, international law, and the failure of international law to ever produce that category of the human, in the same way as you could say happens with the American Constitution. And that seems to be rehearsed again and again in Arendt. And I'm just wondering if you could kind of tease out a tradition, a poetic tradition or a writing tradition which would perform that failure along the national and the failure of international law. So I'm trying to kind of de-American constitutionalise the notion of the law that's in Barbara Johnson's essay. I think that's what yeah. But there's in the written version of this, there's a long footnote on the Johnson. But I think the sewing thing is absolutely right. I mean, this poem, when it's written about, is usually written about from political scientists who are very enamoured of biopolitics and bare life. And what is quite stunning is that it's read straight through. So you either have the humanitarian version that Joey Slaughter talks about, or you have the kind of bare life version, when there's still a bare humanity that's somehow under the poem, where it does seem to, what the poem does is to sort of perform that in terms of speech. And where I had wanted to end up before I got diverted by Kafka was in The Human Condition, where Arendt tries to, it's another anthropological figure, but she, as Etienne Balabour points out in his reading, she kind of reinvests human rights with a new anthropological figure through the right to speech, and she has that version of speaking into as a moment of originality. And that's where I wanted to end up, but I got diverted because of that kind of political community. Going back to your question of what is question about the politics of witness, it didn't seem that we could get to the human condition just yet. So.
Rowan.
I don't want to diverge off this if anyone wants to carry on.
I don't know, did you? It was just really quick on the idea of sewing and suturing, so the idea that sewing, there's something, sewing as a resistance, so that there's a resistance, that it's not silence, but it's speech as the resistant act. But then I was thinking, reading the other day about Derrida on forgiveness and suturing as an act of, healing wounds in that way. Yeah. It's a way there's the two types of sewing. Yeah. But I wonder if that goes into that question of sort of human condition, human rights that come out of that. Yeah. And the question of what happens, when you the sealing of a wound as something that sort of is artificial in that way. Yeah.
But it's interesting because also the other thing you get with the reading of the refugees, I mean, there's also refugees in Britain who did the same thing, is continually cast in terms of pathos. Whereas I read it as angry and political action. Yeah. And there's this sort of willingness to, over-willingness to humanise suffering and to kind of do a bad lyrical reading of the whole thing when it's clearly an act of agency and it's clearly a political act. And it's quite astonishing how people won't. And it's similar with Arendt. People won't read her irony. And she's thoroughly, she never says anything straight. I mean, that's the discourse that it's a romantic legacy of irony, but, I mean, certainly in the 40s, her writing, which I think is at its most powerful, it's always got that kind of really, really angry irony. And there's a willingness just to read through that as if it's not happening.
My question is for Ross. Thank you for your virtuosic paper, and I wanted you to make but I wanted you to make some comments on Lucia's paper, because Shelley in some ways is the most virtuosic of poets as well, not only from the historic accounts of his mesmerising performances of poetry, but also, as you brought up very well, his incredible facility with tetzerima, which is the most kind of bounded and challenging form. And as far as I understood Lucia's argument to be kind of talking something about the way that virtuosity has some analogy with complex analogy with subjection to ideology and so on. I wondered where you might go with sort of taking on your point about his use of form and think about existing political forms for him. I mean, is there anything, well, either just to comment generally on virtuosity or to think more about how his verse does explore kind of direct and present day sort of political questions in a sense, or whether, how triple brass or virtuosic poetry might try and stay in the present as well.
That's interesting. I'm not sure if I can answer that bit, but it's an extremely important suggestion, I think. With regard the idea of mechanism, I think, is absolutely fundamental to Shelley, because it's not something that he's willing simply to dismiss. So he wants to remain resolutely sceptical about the opposition between mechanism on the one hand and, animism, I suppose, on the other. And the problem with mechanism is that it is made to become, if you like, mechanical. So I was struck incidentally by a phrase that Professor Caruth used in Lying in History when she talks about Arendt's criticism of a machine-like mechanism. And that's precisely what Shelley is concerned to criticise, I think. So the mechanical need not necessarily be machine-like. The way it isn't is by being put in service of something humane, really. So this is part of the force of an essay, like a philosophical view of reform, I think. And that has some bearing also on this idea of poetic technique. So that he doesn't, I think, want to oppose the kind of mere material of poetry to inspiration at all, such that therefore the thing that I'm interested in him is the way that it's more interesting to think about the liveliness, if you like, of his poetry, not at all in terms of organic form. I think that's actually uninteresting. But in terms of a kind of fragmented life which is concentrated on particular local effects of technique. So that he talks a lot about the electric life that exists in individual words. I want to take that quite seriously as coming out of this sceptical refusal of an absolute division between mechanism and whatever else you want to call that, which is a way of diverting your question a little bit. But the point about contemporary politics, I think, is very significant, not least with regard to his own era. But I take it that you actually mean our era.
Well, not necessarily. No, I was just thinking. I just wonder how. Yeah, I don't know. We could talk more, but perhaps how political institutions and kind of tight verse forms might, how what binding and unbinding might happen within the kinds of verse that he's interested in, and his interest in history of institutions as well.
Sure. I mean, it's a very painful moment in Shelley, I think. It's part of his antipathy to didactic poetry. So didactic poetry is my abhorrence. But then at the same time, he's kind of agonising in his letters about saying, I've been spending ages on this poetry nonsense, and why can't I just get down to political economy? And those are the two sides of this very painful scepticism, I think, for him.
Yeah, I can't forbear to leave this because I was thinking of how would one continue this? I'm thinking of rhymes for art, and I can only come up with harm, charmed, etc., etc. But then it sort of came back to this question of I know there's a question there, but of chance and the predetermination and what you're calling binding and unbinding, and of course that in the first line of your poem, will you please observe through the wire? There are two different senses of the wire. Through the wire, I'm sewing my feet together, and I'm looking, will you please observe, looking through the wire. So there is again this sort of question of how language may bind and unbind in very painfully political ways, because one's permitted to read in a way that has either tension or utter divergence. Anyway, I'm sorry.
That's really helpful.
I just wanted to follow on really what you were saying, though I didn't know that at the time. And address my question, which is not really much of a question, to Ross, just to take a little bit further his reading of this poem. There's a couple of things which seem to me to be pertinent, particularly to what he was saying about emphatic language and to what Rowan was saying and what Ross was saying in response and what you were saying further about
I think we don't treat each other too much.
Politics of its ambivalence, and I've explained it, I don't need to go on. I wanted to point out, or to ask Ross if he thought this was the case. The first thing about this is that it reminded me quite a lot of the fourth stanza of, fourth and fifth stanzas, in a way, of the Ode to the West Wind. And I was thinking particularly of the last three words, the woeful mass, where it seemed to me that there was a lot more ambiguity than that phrase might be expected to be able to bear.
Indeed.
Both in terms of the meanings of the word mass, and also in the way in which are woeful easily transfers back in an echo of the opening of the poem to "oh, awful." It brings in the sublimity and goes back to the emphatical. And so becomes a concluding which doesn't allow the poem to conclude at its end.
Indeed, yeah. I'd started to think, incidentally, that and I revised this out of the version of the paper that I delivered, so why I bothered, I don't know, given that I'm now going to enunciate this. Anyway, was being sceptical about whether this was a fragment at all. And in some senses, of course, it is, because there's that missing line where he's got that rhyme for Glenn and when, but then can't quite think how he's going to fill that in. So, okay, it's fragmentary. But whether it's fragmentary at its end at all is something that I wouldn't necessarily want to go along with.
It seems quite strongly to me that it isn't, because of the way in which it uses implicit repetition in a quite kind of Caruthian inflected way.
Sure. Well, all I can do is thank you for that point. I mean, the awful hadn't occurred to me. Perhaps I haven't walked around saying this out loud to myself enough, but that's a very good point, I think. And there's obviously a lot more to be done with mass there, crucially, given and not just, what I mean by that is not just to point out its ambivalence, but the fact that it is ambivalent seems to me to rely on a sort of superfluity of lexical meaning, which on the other hand it wants to disavow by drawing language back to its emphatical material basis, if you like. And that crux there, I think, is brilliantly brought out. There are other kinds of things going on there. So, my kind could very easily be mankind as well. So, no, very important.
So
Thank
if
you.
I can just add one more thing. What you were saying about the mechanicity of form also seems to me to echo this question about the way in which originary life, wants to return to its absence. The way that this poem is both sowing and simultaneously disavowing its multivalency makes it both enact and disavow this.
Indeed, or disavow and enact as well. So what I'm interested in thinking through Shelley is that it seems to me that he wants very much to think about the possibility that life is not simply reducible to survival, but finds it very difficult to do that explicitly. And the only way it seems to me that he can do that is through the resources of technique in some ways. That's a speculation at the moment, by the way, I should say.
Wasim and then Gary. Wasim.
I guess I'm sorry to return the discussion back to the first few questions for Professor Stonebridge, but I was just wondering whether you said you felt like you wanted to move on to the human condition and being bogged down really around writings of Kafkan. I was wondering whether actually there's something quite valuable from the wonderful reading you gave for understanding how Arendt's thinking more broadly about what's necessary to achieve human rights, political struggle. In Origins of Totalitarianism, her chapter on the Dreyfus affair, that chapter's often read as presenting quite a simple explanation of how you engage in political action, political struggle to secure rights. From the sounds of it, your reading of Cass suggests she's actually a lot more ambivalent about what is necessary and what can be done to secure rights in an age of totalitarianism. Because if her idiosyncratic reading of the castle, your description of it is accurate, then she suggests that Carr is actually alienated from the testimonies of other people in the village, and actually it's not possible for him to present testimony politically, because testimony, if her reading is depoliticised, the other villagers can't really politicise their suffering. But at the same time, Origins of Totalitarianism suggests that, if you suffer, you give testimony, that's political, that's how you achieve rights. But the reading you've given Cass suggests that's not enough. She doesn't actually have an answer to that question. So that complicates the bigger, lots of the literature on her critique of human rights has suggested, she has a concrete alternative, but your reading of the Kafka piece suggests, she doesn't. She's really chewing over. She's wondering whether, to me it sounds also like what she's partly saying is that the condition of the refugee between Pariah and Pariah is actually necessary to political understanding
Yeah.
at this point.
Yeah, I think,
and actually just pathos and testimony is the point.
Yeah, that's brilliant, and I'll go back to the Dreyfus chapter. But you're also putting me in mind of that discussion of suffering, and which I haven't read for ages, and must reread on Revolution, where she seems to say at the point in which suffering becomes sort of suffering itself and meaningless is the point you can't build the politics around suffering anymore. And people have been quick to read that in terms of her cloth-earedness to the testimony of survivors at the Eichmann trial. And so maybe there's another text we ought to put in here, which is the discussion of suffering in the French Revolution with that. But that's really helpful. And I do think there is a moment in the 40s where she's doing something she doesn't do later on, and then gets kind of lost in the kind of search to find politics out of that moment. But that's really helpful, so I'll go back to the Dreyfus, which is, of course, also about being strange and speaking. Yeah. Thank you.
I have a question, but I think there was one.
There's a question there. Did you want to say something?
Not about that, something else. So.
Jamie.
Mine was something else as well. It was a question to Ross that sort of followed in the series of questions as well. And it was just to ask about the word in your title, over-living, which I thought was really kind of fascinating, a sort of a brilliant English alternate translation to überleben, survivre, and living on, that we sort of know so well in other respects. And all that we were talking about form and the poem sort of going round kind of excessively, and the romantic interest in sort of an excess of life, rather than the reassuring negativity of loss.
Sure.
Is something that I think is sort of really interesting. I wondered if that theoretical side was linked up with that use of the word living.
Good point. When I started to think about these sets of questions, what it seemed to me was that what Shelley was trying to do is to draw this, as I've said, absolute distinction in some sense, in quite romantic vein, between a momentary epiphanic version of life and mere survival, which you can never quite manage to do. But it seems to me that the way that you've just read over living is quite different, actually, which is to say that day-to-day life isn't precisely not over living, that's just living, and it's those moments that themselves are a kind of excess of life. And it seems to me that what Shelley wants to do is to recoup living on in terms of the apprehension of life, as he puts it. So we live on, and in living we lose the apprehension of life. It's not simply that division is to be enforced by him. That would be far too dogmatic and straightforward. It's that overliving itself has to be redeemed in some way. And that's also a political question for him, I think. And it's one that, and perhaps this, going back to Rowan's point, opens into a lot of controversies and difficulties in contemporary thinking about life, as we were talking about last night, so that it seems that there's a problem in contemporary political discourse about the protection of life, and in a sense all that simply means is keeping people breathing, whereas that wouldn't really be living at all for someone like Shelley, and that we might have to think about overliving differently from simply kind of keeping going. I take it incidentally from the title of Emily Wilson's book on tragic overliving, whereby she seeks to resituate the main interest of the tragic tradition from Sophocles to Milton, not in death, but in the fact of people remaining alive after they should have died. So that's what's informing my use of it there. But you've opened out to me a new and alternative way of reading that. I hope that responds in some ways.
Cathy, and I think we might perhaps. Are there any other questions? Because I think it'd be rather nice to sort of stop at 5:45. But are there other people who do have questions at this point? Cathy.
Thank you for helping me reread. I haven't passed through this poem. It's actually really beautifully done. So I wanted to ask you a question. You made a statement at one point about, you didn't say structure, and you didn't quite mean structure, but someone used it anyway. Something like the structure of life, or the movement, or something of life, and of the literary. How would you say are inextricable, or are they not exactly the same, but they're intertwined? So
sure.
Is that what you were...
Yes, so what I think I said was that, and this was a bit of a fudge, I have to admit, that literature's, the way that you describe literature is interested in both knowing and not knowing, allies itself with life's attempt to return and then departure. And I suppose that I've slipped possibly into a quite lazy way of thinking about that in terms of a kind of fruitful analogy. But it seems to me more than that.
Yes, it is. It is, of course. And
yeah.
Even if we put two talks together, the status of language in relation to life is an important one. And thought that way, so survival isn't necessarily a value in and of itself.
No.
It's an imperative. So language also, this language that survives, or literary language, wouldn't necessarily be a value either.
No.
In that sense. I mean, that would have some interesting
things.
But I also wanted to ask you to go back, because I hear slowly, so to this rhyme scheme. So the poem returns, you say, from mass. So you're saying that the rhyme doesn't just return us within the ends of the lines, but to the beginning, which is alas, which is nonetheless not at that time meant as a rhyme, something like that.
So what I suppose I'm interested in is the way in which that first line. I suppose one might say this about rhyme in general, of course, that you don't know whether you have got or missed a rhyme in the first line until you get to the second one. And that is what is going on here, because was does not quite rhyme with pass,
right.
At least in my ear. But it does with alas, right. Which I would have thought a virtuosic syntacist and poet as Shelley was could have stuck at the end of his line if he wanted to get that, perfect rhyme, and he doesn't. He doesn't. So that what's going on here is that the sort of consummation, if you like, of the rhyme scheme is buried back at the beginning. Right. And I feel like you're going somewhere with that.
Well, it also seems like that's one of those questions where it is or is not a rhyme, whether it's determined or not is uncertain.
Oh, good.
Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, it is or is not part of the technical determined rhyme scheme, which would go with your argument.
Yeah. I think I see, and that's a very important point. I can't respond to that at the moment, but I think it's
It's very interesting
because it throws it back on the voice at that point.
Sure, yeah.
Okay, I'm going to just draw us to close, but draw us to close by thanking Cathy, because just for those of you who don't know this, the Mellon listing fellow, which she is, briefly, is under the auspices of something called the Centre for Disciplinary Innovation, and we've tried to particularly have people who have really brought some kind of innovation. I think Cathy, as a student of comparative literature and psychoanalysis, has brought a real innovation not only to literary studies but also to psychoanalysis. It's rather unusual to be able to talk to psychoanalysts. Not always interested in talking to people who read literature.
As I was growing up.
But also now also allowing us to think in ways that may be strange or productive about a rent. And I want to just thank her very much for that, from CRASSH, but also for myself. It's been enormously interesting. So thank you, Cathy, and for your generosity.
And also all the people who wrote today. They were wonderful texts, so thanks for doing it.
And for these terrific papers we've heard today from everybody. Thank you.